There is a version of World War II that almost everyone knows. It has a shape. It has a beginning defined by aggression and an end defined by liberation. It has sides that can be named and judged. It has villains who wore specific uniforms and heroes who wore different ones. That version is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in ways that matter, and the gaps are not small. They are not accidental omissions from history textbooks due to time constraints or sensitivity toward the young. They are the result of deliberate institutional silences, legal decisions made at the highest levels of multiple governments, bureaucratic choices that have never been reversed, and a collective agreement among survivors, politicians, historians, and governments to let certain realities recede into the background noise of a war so large that the background noise itself could swallow almost anything. The war lasted roughly 6 years, depending on which theater and which calendar you use. Somewhere between 70 and 85 million people died, though the exact number will never be known because entire populations were erased without records, and records that existed were destroyed, and destruction of records was in some cases policy rather than accident. The scale was large enough that a number in the millions could be off by several million, and the error would barely register as a rounding problem. That scale is part of what made silence possible. When everything is enormous, the specific enormity of any single thing becomes easier to absorb into the general noise. What follows is not a counter-narrative designed to invert the moral conclusions of that war. It is something more uncomfortable than that. It is an examination of the mechanisms, the systems, the paperwork, the routines, the institutional decisions made by bureaucrats who were not monsters in any recognizable cinematic sense, who went home at night, who filled out forms in triplicate, who followed procedures developed over months and years by committees, who operated within legal frameworks that had been designed, reviewed, and approved by people with advanced degrees and professional credentials. The disturbing thing is not that the war produced evil. The disturbing thing is how efficiently it was organized. The first reality that veterans rarely discussed was the degree to which their own armies operated in ways that bore no resemblance to the moral clarity of the cause they were fighting for. American soldiers entered the war on the side of democracy. That is accurate in the sense that the United States was fighting against governments that had formally rejected democratic principles. It is less accurate as a description of what American soldiers found when they reported for duty. The United States Army in 1941 was a rigidly segregated institution. Black soldiers were assigned to separate units, given separate facilities, fed at separate tables, and in many cases assigned to labor and logistics roles rather than combat roles, not because of any assessment of their capabilities, but because the institutional structure of the Army had been built on racial hierarchy, and the Army chose to maintain that structure even as it mobilized to fight a regime whose own racial ideology it publicly condemned. This was not a secret. It was policy. It was written down. It was enforced by military police. It was defended by generals who gave interviews and wrote memos explaining that integration would harm unit cohesion, which was the institutional language for saying that white soldiers from certain parts of the country would resist serving alongside black soldiers, and that rather than compel them to adapt, the Army would accommodate their resistance at the expense of the men being excluded. Black soldiers who had been trained as fighter pilots, who had completed all the same requirements as their white counterparts, were initially barred from combat assignments. When the Tuskegee Airmen were eventually allowed to fly combat missions, it was after sustained pressure from civil rights organizations and a series of internal reviews that the Army had resisted and delayed. When those pilots flew with distinction, the Army's response was not institutional acknowledgement that its initial position had been wrong. The records of their achievements were properly filed and in some cases highlighted for public relations purposes, while the policy of segregation itself continued. The cognitive architecture that allowed this required no special mental effort. The war was against fascism. The Army was segregated. These two facts coexisted without apparent strain on the institution because the institution had procedures for maintaining both simultaneously. The second reality is what happened to American soldiers who broke, or who were perceived to have broken, under the pressures of combat. The official language was shell shock in the First War and combat fatigue in the Second, but neither term was used with much institutional sympathy. The military psychiatry apparatus of World War II was in its earliest operational phases. There were doctors and there were protocols, but the dominant institutional attitude towards soldiers who could no longer function after sustained combat exposure was not primarily medical, it was disciplinary. The line between a psychiatric casualty and a malingerer was drawn by officers who had institutional incentives to minimize the number of men being removed from the line for psychiatric reasons, because the line needed men, and because the Army's culture treated any form of psychological incapacity as a moral failing before it treated it as a medical condition. Soldiers who were sent back to the rear for psychiatric evaluation sometimes returned to combat within days. The pressure to return men to duty was constant and systemic. The Surgeon General's office issued guidance, unit commanders had replacement quotas, and the whole system created incentives that ran directly against the welfare of individual soldiers whose minds had been genuinely damaged by sustained exposure to combat. Some of those men were disciplined for their inability to function. Some were court-martialed. The Army executed one American soldier for desertion during World War II, a private named Eddie Slovic, and his execution was carried out in January 1945 in France, and it was carried out specifically because General Dwight Eisenhower chose not to grant clemency after reviewing the case, a decision made in part because desertion had become common enough that the command structure believed a visible execution might serve as a deterrent. Slovic had asked to be assigned to a non-combat role. He had been clear about his inability to face combat. He had written a statement that amounted to a formal request for an alternative assignment. The Army read that statement as a confession of desertion and processed it accordingly. The third reality concerns what American and British forces did in the air war. The strategic bombing campaign is the most extensively documented and least examined component of Allied military action in the war. The doctrine of strategic bombing had been developed in the interwar period by theorists in multiple countries who believed that bombing industrial capacity and civilian morale would shorten future wars by destroying the enemy's ability and will to fight. The United States Army Air Forces and the British Royal Air Force both entered the war with versions of this doctrine, and the British version evolved during the war in ways that the RAF's own leadership understood to be targeting civilian populations rather than industrial infrastructure. The area bombing campaign against German cities, which accelerated through 1943, 1944, and into 1945, was not the product of confusion or poor targeting technology, though poor targeting technology was real. It was a deliberate strategic choice made by Arthur Harris, the commander of RAF Bomber Command, with the knowledge and at least partial approval of his superiors, to attack German cities as cities, to burn them, to destroy the housing stock and the civilian infrastructure, to kill enough civilians that German morale would collapse, or German industrial workers would become too disrupted to maintain production. The British government was aware of this. Churchill was aware of this. The targeting documents exist. The planning memos exist. The casualty estimates were calculated in advance. The operational goal of killing large numbers of German civilians was not a side effect of the bombing campaign. It was one of its explicit objectives, written into the planning and assessed against results. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 has received more attention than most operations of this campaign, partly because it came late in the war when German defeat was already certain, and partly because the death toll, while disputed, was clearly substantial. But Dresden was not exceptional within the campaign. Hamburg had been firebombed in 1943 in an operation that killed somewhere between 30 and 40,000 people in a few days, generating a firestorm hot enough to incinerate people in air raid shelters and pull people off their feet and into the flames through the convection currents the fire itself created. The planning documents for Hamburg described the firestorm as a desired outcome. The meteorological conditions that would enable one were assessed, and the operation was timed accordingly. The number of dead was reported up the chain of command and assessed against operational goals. The operation was considered a success. The American daylight precision bombing campaign was operationally distinct from the British area bombing campaign in doctrine, if not always in practice. American bombers were supposed to be targeting specific industrial facilities. But high-altitude precision bombing in the 1940s was not precise in any meaningful sense. The Norden bomb sight, which American bombardiers used and which had been described in some pre-war contexts as a device so accurate it could drop a bomb in a pickle barrel, produced results in combat that were dramatically less accurate than its laboratory performance. Bombs fell miles from their intended targets routinely. Cities were hit because the industrial facilities near them were missed. The institutional response to this gap between doctrine and operational reality was not to revise the doctrine. It was to increase the number of bombs dropped, on the grounds that if enough bombs were dropped in the general area of the target, some percentage would hit the target. The increase in bombs dropped increased the area affected and increased civilian casualties, which were recorded in after-action reports as collateral damage and assessed against the cost of the operation rather than as a variable to be minimized. The fourth reality concerns the treatment of German prisoners of war by American forces in the final months of the war. As the European war ended in the spring of 1945, the American military found itself holding an enormous number of German prisoners, somewhere between 3 and 4 million, in the weeks immediately following the German surrender. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be held in established camps with adequate food, water, and shelter, that their status be recorded, and that they be repatriated after the end of hostilities. The United States, which had ratified the Geneva Convention, developed a workaround. German prisoners were reclassified not as prisoners of war, but as disarmed enemy forces or surrendered enemy personnel, a category that did not exist in the Geneva Convention and that the Army's Judge Advocate General's office had identified as legally questionable but operationally convenient because it removed the Geneva Convention's protections from the men in that category. Men classified as surrendered enemy personnel were held in open fields, surrounded by wire in some cases, in conditions that lacked adequate shelter, food, or sanitation. The Rhine Meadow camps, a series of these holding areas along the Rhine River, held several 100,000 men in the spring and early summer of 1945. The death toll in those camps is disputed, and the records are incomplete in ways that historians have argued reflect deliberate inadequacy rather than administrative confusion. Estimates of the number of Germans who died in American captivity in the months following the German surrender range from a few thousand to numbers significantly larger, and the debate continues in part because the records that would settle it were never adequately maintained and in some cases appear to have been lost or destroyed. The institutional decision to reclassify prisoners to remove their Geneva Convention protections was made by people who understood what they were doing. It was a legal maneuver executed by lawyers in uniform to solve a logistical problem by removing an inconvenient legal constraint. The fifth reality is the behavior of Soviet forces as they moved westward through German-occupied territory and then into Germany itself. The scale of what Soviet soldiers did to civilian populations in the Eastern Territories, in East Prussia, in Pomerania, in Silesia, in Berlin, is documented in Soviet military records, in German survivor accounts, in reports filed by military correspondents, and in assessments made by Soviet commanders who noted the behavior in their own diaries and dispatches while frequently doing nothing to stop it. The systematic rape of German women and girls by Soviet soldiers during the advance into Germany affected somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million women, depending on which set of estimates is used. The Soviet military command was aware of what was happening. Some officers attempted to limit it, and some of those officers were themselves disciplined for interfering with their soldiers' conduct. The institutional tolerance for sexual violence against German civilians was not a policy in the formal sense that it was written into orders, but it functioned as a policy in the operational sense that it was permitted, that complaints were ignored, that perpetrators were not systematically punished, and that the behavior continued for months in Soviet-occupied territory after the formal end of the war. The Soviet political commissar system had spent years telling soldiers that the Germans were not human in the ordinary sense, that German soldiers and German civilians represented an undifferentiated enemy that had murdered Soviet civilians by the millions during the German occupation of Soviet territory. And that view was not entirely inaccurate as a description of what German forces had done in the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht and the SS had killed Soviet civilians on a scale that remains among the largest massacres in recorded history. The institutional processing of that reality by the Soviet military was not to establish a clear boundary between legitimate military objectives and prohibited conduct towards civilians. It was to allow the accumulated moral debt of German conduct to be collected in an uncontrolled way from the German civilian population, which bore the accumulated grievances of a conflict that had killed somewhere between 25 and 27 million Soviet citizens. The sixth reality is the medical experiments conducted by Japanese military researchers in China and Manchuria under the institutional framework of Unit 731. The scale and duration of those experiments, which lasted from the early 1930s through the end of the war, the degree to which they were institutionally supported, the number of people killed in them, which is estimated at somewhere between 3,000 and 12,000 based on available records, with the actual number likely higher, and the fate of the researchers who conducted them, represents one of the most comprehensive institutional failures of post-war justice. Unit 731 operated with the knowledge and approval of the Imperial Japanese Army's senior leadership. It conducted vivisection on living prisoners without anesthesia, deliberately infected prisoners with plague, cholera, and typhoid to study disease progression, conducted frostbite experiments by immersing limbs in ice water to assess tissue damage, and ran pressure experiments by placing prisoners in hyperbaric chambers and increasing pressure until blood vessels ruptured. These were not conducted by aberrant individuals. They were conducted by trained physicians and scientists following research protocols that were reviewed and approved within the institutional structure of the Imperial Japanese Army. After the Japanese surrender, the United States military intelligence apparatus, specifically the group that would eventually become components of the post-war intelligence structure, made a decision to grant immunity from prosecution to the researchers of Unit 731 in exchange for the data from their experiments. General Douglas MacArthur approved this arrangement. The decision was made on the grounds that the experimental data on biological weapons and disease transmission had military value, and that prosecuting the researchers would result in that data being denied to American researchers and potentially becoming available to the Soviet Union instead. The men who had conducted those experiments, who had killed thousands of prisoners in the process, were never prosecuted. They returned to civilian life in Japan, many of them to careers in medicine, pharmaceuticals, and academia. Some received positions of professional distinction. The institutional decision to prioritize intelligence value over accountability was made at the highest levels of the American Military Occupation Authority and was kept classified for decades. The seventh reality is the deliberate famine engineered in Bengal by British wartime policy in 1943. The Bengal famine is not always included in histories of World War II, partly because it occurred in the colonial periphery rather than the European theatre, and partly because the institutional decisions that caused it were made within the framework of imperial administration rather than military command in the conventional sense. But it was a wartime event caused by wartime decisions, and it killed somewhere between 2 and 3 million people, with some estimates placing the number higher. The immediate cause was a combination of a rice crop failure, wartime inflation, and the disruption of normal trade patterns by the war. The structural cause was the decision by the British wartime government, with Winston Churchill as Prime Minister, to prioritize the export of food from Bengal to European theatres and to maintain those exports even as it became clear that famine conditions were developing. Churchill's documented views on the Bengal famine are not ambiguous. He is recorded in War Cabinet minutes as expressing contempt for the suffering of Indian civilians and as attributing the famine to the Indians themselves for breeding excessively and eating too much. Requests from the Viceroy of India for emergency food shipments were denied or delayed. The War Cabinet's assessment was that the food was needed elsewhere and that the Indian situation, while unfortunate, did not justify diverting shipping capacity from European operations. The decision was bureaucratic in the most precise sense. Food was available, ships were available. The decision was made at the policy level to allocate those resources elsewhere, and millions of people died of starvation in the consequent months. The Colonial Office documented the death toll. The records exist. The decisions that produced the famine are traceable through archival sources to specific people at specific meetings making specific choices. The eighth reality is what the Allied forces did with the surviving infrastructure of the Nazi state after the war ended. Operation Paperclip, which brought German scientists and engineers into American employment in the post-war period, is the most extensively documented component of this process. But it was part of a broader institutional response to German technical knowledge that prioritized utility over accountability. Werner von Braun, who became the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and the chief architect of the Saturn V rocket that sent American astronauts to the moon, had been a member of the Nazi Party and the SS, had used concentration camp slave labor in the production of the V-2 rockets he developed during the war, and had visited the Mittelwerk factory where those rockets were built, a factory carved into a mountain by concentration camp prisoners who died there in large numbers from overwork, malnutrition, and summary execution. His membership in the SS and his use of slave labor were known to the American officers who processed his case and arranged his transfer to the United States. Documents were altered. Immigration forms were filled out with information that omitted or falsified the relevant history. The institutional priority was the rocket program and the Cold War advantage that von Braun's expertise represented. The accountability question was resolved by not asking it. Von Braun was not exceptional within Paperclip. More than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were brought to the United States under the program. The State Department objected to some of these transfers on the grounds that the individuals involved had documented histories of war crimes or direct participation in the Nazi apparatus. And in a number of cases, those objections were overridden by the War Department and the Joint Chiefs of Staff on the grounds of strategic necessity. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, which administered the program, maintained two sets of files on some of the scientists. An internal file containing the full history and an external file with the problematic portions removed. The procedure for sanitizing records was not improvised. It was a documented institutional process. The ninth reality is the treatment of Japanese American civilians by the United States government during the war. Executive Order 9066, signed by Franklin Roosevelt in February 1942, authorized the forced relocation of Japanese Americans from the West Coast to internment camps in the interior of the country. Approximately 120,000 people were interned, the majority of them American citizens. The process was administered by the War Relocation Authority, which was a federal agency with a budget, a staff, a director, and a set of procedures for processing, transporting, and confining the people under its authority. Internees were required to report to assembly centers, which were often converted fairgrounds and racetracks, with whatever they could carry. Property that could not be carried was left behind or sold at distressed prices to buyers who understood the sellers had no leverage. Farms, businesses, and homes were lost. The stated justification was military necessity, the concern that Japanese Americans might engage in espionage or sabotage in the event of a Japanese attack on the West Coast. The intelligence assessments that were available to the government at the time of the order did not support this concern. The FBI Director, J. Edgar Hoover, had advised that mass internment was unnecessary and that the specific individuals who presented actual security concerns had already been identified and could be handled through existing law enforcement procedures. His assessment was not acted upon. The War Department's own intelligence officers had reached similar conclusions. The decision to intern the entire Japanese-American population of the West Coast was made despite the available intelligence rather than because of it. German Americans and Italian Americans were not interned on any comparable scale, though the United States was at war with Germany and Italy as well. The differential treatment was not hidden. It was defended on racial grounds in some internal communications and in some public statements. The Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of the internment in Korematsu, United States in 1944 in a decision that reasoned the military necessity claim justified the suspension of the constitutional rights of a racial group. That decision was not formally overturned until 2018. The camps operated until 1945. Internees who returned to the West Coast after release found their property gone in most cases. Compensation was not provided until 1988, when the Civil Liberties Act acknowledged that the internment had been the result of racial prejudice and wartime hysteria rather than military necessity. The 10th reality concerns what happened to civilians in the Pacific Theater under both American and Japanese military operations in the island campaigns. The island-hopping campaign across the Pacific involved a series of battles on small islands where Japanese and American forces fought in conditions of extreme intensity, often in jungle terrain, often in heat, and in several cases against Japanese defenders who had been ordered to fight to the last man rather than surrender. The treatment of Japanese prisoners by American forces and the treatment of American prisoners by Japanese forces both reflected institutional attitudes that had been developed over years of conflict and propaganda, and that resulted in practices that violated the laws of war as understood at the time. American soldiers killed Japanese prisoners, including wounded prisoners, and this was documented in survivor accounts, in the diaries of American soldiers, and in reports that reached command level. The institutional response in many cases was not prosecution, but the informal acknowledgement that combat conditions in the Pacific had developed in a direction where prisoner-taking was not always practiced. Admiral William Halsey made statements during the war that described the Japanese in dehumanizing terms, calling explicitly for the killing rather than capture of Japanese personnel, and those statements were made in his official capacity and reported in the press and did not result in any formal rebuke from his superiors. The cultural framework within which Pacific combat operated had been constructed over years of institutional output from the military, from government communications, from commercial media, and from the popular press, all of which had contributed to a representation of the Japanese enemy as something other than fully human, as fanatical, as incomprehensible, as incapable of the normal conduct that would make surrender and prisoner management possible. Japanese treatment of American and Allied prisoners was systematically brutal and is extensively documented. The Bataan Death March of April 1942, in which approximately 76,000 American and Filipino prisoners were marched roughly 65 miles under conditions of deliberate brutality, with guards killing prisoners who fell, who were too weak to continue, who asked for water, or who were simply selected at random, resulted in the deaths of somewhere between 5,000 and 18,000 prisoners, depending on which estimates and which component of the full operation are counted. The institutional structure of the Japanese military had developed a formal position consistent with the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors that surrender was a moral failure rather than a legitimate military option, and this position was applied to prisoners as well, on the reasoning that men who had chosen to surrender had forfeited the protections that combatants would otherwise receive. That reasoning was not improvised by individual guards. It was the product of an institutional culture that had developed over decades. The 11th reality is the full scope of the Holocaust's administrative apparatus, which is historically documented and yet remains routinely underestimated in terms of the degree to which it functioned as an ordinary bureaucratic enterprise. The operations of the Einsatzgruppen in the Eastern Territories, beginning in 1941, were reported up the chain of command in detailed operational reports that described the number of people killed, the methods used, the categories of victim, and the logistical details of disposal. Those reports were filed, organized, and preserved within the German bureaucratic system in the same format used for any other military or administrative report. They contained tables. They contained summary statistics. They were sent to multiple offices. They were read and acknowledged. The men who wrote them were not primarily seeking to shock their superiors. They were completing their reporting requirements. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942, at which senior officials of multiple German government agencies met to coordinate the implementation of what they called the final solution, produced minutes that are among the most precisely bureaucratic documents in the history of state-organized mass murder. The conference was attended by 15 senior officials, including representatives of the SS, the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of the Interior, the Foreign Office, and several other agencies. The minutes, drafted by Adolf Eichmann, described the proposed scope of operations in terms of the number of Jews in each European country, which were laid out in a table, and the logistical challenges of coordinating operations across multiple agencies and jurisdictions. The language throughout is administrative. The conference was scheduled and run like any interagency coordination meeting of that era. Refreshments were served. The meeting lasted roughly 90 minutes. It ended with participants returning to their offices to implement what had been agreed. The rail logistics of the deportation operations were managed by the Deutsche Reichsbahn, the German National Railway, which issued tickets for the deportation transports under standard bureaucratic procedures and charged standard freight rates for human cargo, calculating the rate per person per kilometer transported according to existing rail tariff schedules. The railway administrators who processed these transport requests were railway administrators. They had schedules to manage and rolling stock to allocate. The deportation trains competed with military supply trains for track time, and the allocation decisions were made through the normal scheduling process, with the SS submitting transport requests that were processed by railway planners alongside requests from other agencies. The railway kept records. The records of the deportation trains are extensive. They describe origins, destinations, number of passengers, dates, and the costs charged for the transport. The 12th reality is what happened to survivors of the camps in the immediate post-war period. The liberation of the camps by Allied forces in the spring of 1945 produced a public record of photographs, film footage, and testimony that was immediately and widely distributed, partly for genuine documentary purposes and partly because Allied command understood that establishing the visual record of what the camps contained would be necessary for post-war political purposes and would be necessary to counter any future claims that the camps had not existed or had not been as described. But the liberation of the camps did not immediately translate into adequate care for their survivors. Allied forces that liberated camps had not in many cases been prepared for what they found and did not in many cases have the medical and logistical capacity to process the health needs of severely malnourished and ill survivors. Some survivors died in the days and weeks after liberation from the effects of what the camps had done to them, in some cases because the food provided to them was too rich for their damaged digestive systems to process, a problem that Allied medics identified and wrote about at the time. The displaced persons camps that housed concentration camp survivors and other displaced European civilians after the war were, in the early months, often overcrowded, inadequately supplied, and administratively overwhelmed. Jewish survivors in particular frequently found themselves housed in camps located in Germany and administered by Allied forces who were simultaneously managing the occupation of the country, whose government had tried to kill them. General George Patton, who commanded the Third Army and was responsible for displaced persons in his zone, made statements in his diary and in communications that expressed contempt for Jewish displaced persons, described them in dehumanizing terms, and resisted the pressure to improve conditions in the camps under his authority. A report commissioned by President Truman and produced by Earl Harrison found conditions in the displaced persons camps to be inadequate and in some cases similar in appearance to the conditions the camps were supposedly replacing. Truman sent the Harrison report to Eisenhower with a note expressing his concern. Eisenhower responded with defensiveness. Conditions improved gradually over subsequent months through a combination of pressure, organizational learning, and the arrival of more resources. The 13th reality is the use of starvation as an operational tool by the German military in the Soviet Union, specifically in the siege of Leningrad and in the treatment of Soviet prisoners of war. The German military's handling of Soviet prisoners of war in 1941 and 1942 resulted in the deaths of the majority of the prisoners captured in that period, somewhere between 2 and 3 million men, through a combination of deliberate starvation, exposure, disease, and summary execution. This was not accidental. The Wehrmacht's planning for the Eastern Campaign had included explicit decisions about the allocation of food resources, which concluded that Soviet prisoners of war would not receive sufficient calories to survive, because feeding them adequately would require food that was needed for German forces and for the civilian populations of the occupied territories. The planning documents for this policy are preserved in the German Federal Archives. The decision was made at the highest levels of military planning. It was implemented systematically. The death rate in Soviet prisoner camps in the winter of 1941 to 1942 was calculated in German reports at the time, and the numbers were reviewed by senior officials who continued the policy. The siege of Leningrad, which lasted from September 1941 to January 1944, was maintained by German forces as a starvation operation. The city was encircled and its food supplies were cut off. German forces shelled supply routes. The plan, as expressed in German military documents, was not to capture the city, but to let it die. The anticipated outcome was the death of the city's population from starvation and cold, which would resolve the military and logistical problem of what to do with a city of several million people in the rear of German lines, without requiring the German military to engage in urban combat. Approximately 1 million civilians died in Leningrad during the siege, the majority from starvation. The German military command was aware of the civilian death toll and regarded it as an acceptable outcome of a policy choice rather than as an operational problem requiring correction. The 14th reality is the collaboration of local populations across occupied Europe with German occupation authorities, a phenomenon that was extensive, that was documented by the Germans at the time, that was partially suppressed in the post-war period by the governments of the countries where it occurred, and that in some cases involved the participation of ordinary civilians, local police forces, and local government officials in the identification, arrest, and deportation of Jewish populations to German camps. In France, the Vichy government administered a zone of the country with the approval of the German occupation authorities and implemented anti-Jewish legislation, carried out censuses of Jewish residents, and cooperated with German deportation operations, including the Veldiv Roundup of July 1942, in which approximately 13,000 Jews were arrested by French police, held in a Paris sports arena for days in conditions without adequate food, water, or sanitation, and then transferred to German custody for deportation. The roundup was planned and executed by French authorities. The German SS officer responsible for Jewish affairs in France was concerned that the French police might not cooperate at the scale required. They cooperated at the required scale. The post-war French government maintained for decades the position that the Vichy government had not been the legitimate French government, that France as a nation had been represented by the Free French forces under de Gaulle, and that therefore French national responsibility for the actions of the Vichy government could not be attributed to the French Republic. This legal and historical argument provided the basis for not prosecuting many French collaborators and for declining to acknowledge French state responsibility for the deportations. The French state did not officially acknowledge its responsibility for the Veldiv Roundup until 1995, when President Jacques Chirac made a formal statement accepting that responsibility. The roundup occurred in 1942. The acknowledgement occurred 53 years later. In the interim, French textbooks had described the occupation in terms that minimized the extent of collaboration. The 15th reality is what the war did to the men who fought it in the years after they returned. The psychological damage inflicted by sustained combat exposure, by the experience of killing, by witnessing the deaths of friends and strangers, by living in conditions of continuous physical deprivation and constant danger for months or years, was not adequately understood, was not adequately treated, and was in many cases actively suppressed by a combination of institutional pressure and cultural expectation. The men who returned from the war were welcomed as heroes, which was an accurate description of their service and an inadequate description of their psychological state. The cultural expectation was that they would return to civilian life, resume their previous roles or build new ones, and process whatever they had experienced in private or not at all, because processing it publicly was not available to them in a culture that had decided the war was over, and the men who had fought it should be grateful they had survived. Veterans of the Pacific Theater in particular returned with experiences that they frequently could not describe to the people around them, not because of security classification, but because the gap between what they had experienced and what the people around them could comprehend was too wide to bridge in ordinary conversation. Many of them did not try. The rate of alcoholism among World War II veterans in the post-war decades was documented in military health records and Veterans Administration studies at levels significantly above the general population. Domestic violence rates were elevated. Suicide rates were elevated. The psychological infrastructure for treating what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist in any adequate form, and even if it had existed, many veterans would not have accessed it because the cultural framework in which they lived defined their distress as weakness rather than as injury. The VA system in the immediate post-war period was administratively overwhelmed. The sheer number of returning veterans, somewhere between 12 and 16 million Americans who had served in uniform, produced a demand for services that the system was not resourced to meet. Mental health services within the VA were limited, underfunded, and structured around a model that prioritized physical wounds over psychological ones. Veterans who presented with psychological symptoms were frequently told that their problems were not service-connected, a bureaucratic finding that determined eligibility for benefits, and that was made by VA adjudicators following established criteria rather than by clinicians making individualized assessments. The denial of service connection for psychological conditions was not motivated by malice. It was the product of a system applying its rules, and the rules had been written in a way that systematically undervalued psychological injury relative to physical injury. The 16th reality is the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the process by which the decision to use those weapons was made. The decision is the most extensively studied military decision of the 20th century and remains the subject of ongoing historical debate, but the core institutional process by which it was made has been documented through the declassification of the relevant records. The Target Committee, which met in the spring of 1945 to select the targets for the atomic bombs, produced meeting minutes that describe its deliberations in precise operational terms. The committee's criteria for target selection included requirements that the target be large enough that the bomb's effects could be accurately assessed, that it be a city that had not been previously heavily damaged by conventional bombing, so that the effects of the atomic bomb could be distinguished from the effects of conventional bombing, and that it have military significance. The committee explicitly considered and rejected the option of a demonstration bombing of an uninhabited area, on the grounds that if the demonstration failed to produce a Japanese surrender, the element of surprise would have been lost. The interim committee, which advised the Secretary of War on the use of the bomb, considered whether the Japanese should be warned before the attack. The decision not to warn was made on the grounds that a warning might allow Japanese forces to move Allied prisoners of war to the target area, which would complicate the political response to the attack, and on the grounds that a warning might allow Japanese air defenses to prepare a response that could interfere with the delivery aircraft. The committee also discussed targeting preferences. and the record of those discussions indicates that committee members expressed preference for targets that would make the greatest impression on the Japanese government, which was understood to mean targets with large civilian populations in close proximity to the designated military or industrial objectives. The language of the meetings is the language of a technical planning process. The Hiroshima bomb killed somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 people immediately, and a total of somewhere between 90,000 and 166,000 people by the end of 1945 from the combined effects of the blast, the heat, and the radiation. The Nagasaki bomb killed somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people. The precise numbers are not known because the administrative infrastructure that would have recorded deaths was destroyed along with the populations it served. The Japanese government's formal announcement of surrender cited the new type of bomb as a factor in the decision, though the internal deliberations of the Japanese War Cabinet have been analyzed by historians in ways that suggest the picture was more complicated and that the Soviet declaration of war against Japan on August 8th between the two atomic bombings may have been at least as significant a factor in the final decision. The institutional American assessment at the time and in the decades immediately following was that the bombs had shortened the war and saved lives that would have been lost in an invasion of the Japanese home islands. That assessment was built into the official narrative and into the public memory of the event, and remained largely undisturbed in American public discourse for decades. The 17th reality is the architecture of post-war accountability, which was constructed to serve the political needs of the victorious powers rather than to establish universal principles that those powers themselves would be subject to. The Nuremberg trials were genuine in the sense that they established documentary records, heard testimony, and produced verdicts based on evidence rather than mere assertion. They were also selective in ways that the chief prosecutors understood. The indictment at Nuremberg included charges related to crimes against peace, the planning and waging of aggressive war, which in principle applied to any government that initiated military conflict for reasons other than self-defense. The Soviet Union, which had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Germany in 1939 and had invaded Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the subsequent months, was one of the four powers sitting in judgment at Nuremberg. The prosecution of German defendants for crimes against peace was pursued by a tribunal that included representatives of a government that had itself committed what the tribunal's own definition would have classified as crimes against peace. This was known to everyone involved. It was managed institutionally by keeping the scope of the charges focused on German conduct and by not examining the conduct of the prosecuting powers with comparable rigor. The Tokyo trials, formerly the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, were organized and conducted under conditions that reflected the American occupation's political priorities more directly than Nuremberg had reflected Allied political consensus. General MacArthur, as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, controlled the tribunal and made key decisions about its scope, including the decision to protect Emperor Hirohito from prosecution. The decision to grant immunity to the emperor was made on the grounds that prosecuting him would destabilize the occupation and make administering post-war Japan more difficult. The emperor's documented role in wartime decisions, including decisions related to the conduct of operations that resulted in atrocities, was treated as insufficient to support prosecution, and the evidence that might have supported it was handled in ways that reflected the predetermined conclusion. Senior military and government officials were prosecuted and in several cases executed. The emperor attended the races at the Imperial Horse Racing Club in the months following the end of the war. The institutional frameworks established at Nuremberg and Tokyo, which became the foundational documents for the development of international humanitarian law in the post-war period, were built on the principle that there exist crimes of sufficient magnitude that they cannot be addressed by the domestic legal systems of the states that commit them, and that international accountability is therefore both possible and necessary. That principle was articulated by the same governments that had bombed civilian cities, maintained colonial famines, used forced labor, conducted medical experiments on prisoners for intelligence purposes, and built internment systems for their own citizens. The principle was genuine, and its articulation was meaningful, and its subsequent development into the body of international humanitarian law that exists today was real and consequential. And the governments that articulated it exempted themselves from its application with a thoroughness that was not accidental. The Nuremberg principles were invoked in the post-war period when they applied to other states, and were not invoked when they might have applied to the states that created them. The decisions made in the immediate post-war period about which individuals would be prosecuted, which records would be preserved, which programs would be classified, and which institutional arrangements would be maintained or transferred into the post-war order were made by the same governments and in many cases by the same people who had operated those systems during the war. The scientists transferred under paperclip worked in American research facilities. The intelligence networks built by German intelligence in Eastern Europe were in some cases transferred to American control and operated under American direction in the early years of the Cold War. The procedures developed for managing occupied populations, for using economic pressure to shape the behavior of dependent states, for operating detention systems outside normal legal frameworks, were archived and in some cases adapted rather than abandoned. The war ended in formal terms in September 1945 with the Japanese surrender ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The ceremony was organized with precision. The documents were signed in a specific order by representatives of the Allied powers and by representatives of the Japanese government. Photographs were taken. General MacArthur spoke. The administrative apparatus of the occupation went into effect immediately after the signatures were applied. Supply trains were redirected. Occupation zones were administered. Courts were convened. New governments were established in Germany and Japan under occupation oversight, and those governments eventually became the governments those countries had for the remainder of the 20th century. The administrative infrastructure of the war was converted, procedure by procedure and form by form, into the administrative infrastructure of the post-war order. The men who had designed the systems that enabled what the war contained were, in most cases, still at their desks.